Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Art Like Everything Else, the podcast. I am your host, Simone, and this week we're going to be talking about art and forgiveness. And so now, forgiveness is a concept that I think many people are familiar with. So according to Merriam-Webster, actually, forgiveness is defined as the act of forgiving, with the word forgive actually meaning to cease to feel resentment against an offender, like that's in parentheses, and then also to give up resentment of or claim to requital. There's also the third part that's just like about forgiveness of debt, essentially, to grant a relief from payment. But that's not really the version of the definition we're going to be working with today. Now, so for this week's episode, I want to take a look at at two different works of art to kind of and discuss forgiveness. So like I want to look at like expectations, how to create it, or how to like the reality, and like just how complicated it actually is. Now, if you have any favorite works of art, whether that be poems, whether that be movies, shows, art like paintings, anything, music even, let me know about it in the comments. Any favorite work of art related to forgiveness that you found or is like been really like maybe like important to you, let me know in the comments below, and I'll be sure to check it out. But with that being said, let's get started. So for our first work of art, I'm actually going to be starting with our most recent work for this episode, and that is a Tamil short film by the name of Marakkave Ninaikiren, which is translated, like when translated to English, is actually remembering to forget. And so this short film can be found on YouTube, on the Italy Up My channel. I'm going to link the channel, well, at least I'm going to link the short film in the description below, and it'll be directly on the channel. I recommend the subscription. I really like the shorts that I've been watching on there so far. They're really, really engaging. But so this particular short film was released in June 23rd of 2023, and it's only 34 minutes long. It's a beautifully told story. And if you like to view it spoiler free, I would suggest you watch it now, or so like you can pause this video, hop over, watch it. It's literally like 34 minutes, and then you can pop back over and listen to me talk about it. I'm going to leave a link to it in the comments below. There are English subtitles, and it is incredibly good. So like, I highly recommend it. Now, Marakkave Ninaikiren follows a couple, Kanagu and Sumi, who are married. When we meet them, they are married, and they are actually talking about their future at a temple. So they're discussing things like their baby's name, what they want it to mean, like how they want to be as parents. Something that is important to remember is that during this talk, Kanagu, so the husband, he's talking about how he doesn't want to be anything like his father, who was an alcoholic and who fought with his mother. And so we fast forward in time. Now this little story kind of telling like motif is actually used at least a few times in this short film. So like it switches between like the past and the present so that we get the full picture. But anyways, we are now in the future, and Sumi and Kanagu are not talking actually. We found out that Sumi has not spoken to Kanagu in 2 years. He has shown up to the temple that she goes to every day for 2 years, and she has not spoken to him that entire time. We get the idea that he has done something that she has just not been able to get over, and it's like kind of like around this time she gets a call from her mother, and like ultimately agrees to talk to him because her mom's like, talk to him, he's showing up all this time, like give him a chance, hear him out type stuff. And so she actually finally hears him out. We get a flashback, and so we go back to the past, and we're at another time. And so at this point we get we kind of start to get an idea of why they aren't talking. So in this particular flashback, Sumi's a lot further along in her pregnancy, and Kanagu is drunk. Like, it seems as though he like went to the temple to kind of like pick her up. But he's drunk, like incredibly drunk, like slurring his words, kind of like falling over and stuff. And like he is trying to get Sumi, who is pregnant, mind you, to ride on, give her a ride on his bike, so they can go home. And she says no, and she takes the bus. However, he doesn't really like this, and he kind of proceeds to make this whole commotion about her taking the bus home. And it's just a whole issue. And so after that happens, we actually flash back to the future, and it's Kanagu and Sumi are talking, and Kanagu is asking for forgiveness. And so they talk for a while about what forgiveness is and go into detail about why Kanagu kind of wants forgiveness. And it's here that we learn that another reason, besides him turning to drinking a lot after promising not to in the beginning, he also had an argument with Sumi that was so bad it actually scared their child. And so he talks about how even he can't kind of like feel like he can't forgive himself, and he will understand if Sumi couldn't forgive him. And Sumi talks about her fears and how she was traumatized by the incident, and that like, but like she does want to be able to forgive him ultimately. She's kind of just afraid of not giving him a fair chance, essentially. Ultimately, she does kind of decide to forgive him, and this is shown by her inviting him on a bus ride home when she's leaving the temple, and like he joins her. And like he literally because he rode up there on a bike, and he literally leaves his bike so that he's able to ride the bus home with her. And I thought that was really sweet. But yeah, this is a really beautiful film. It follows what some might refer to as like a sort of like traditional route of seeking and being granted forgiveness. But that's definitely not like the only way forgiveness happens. And we can see that in our next work of art. In our next work of art, I watched the movie The Stoning of Soraya M. So this movie was released in 2008, and it's actually based on a book and a true story. So the book was called La Femme Lapidée, and it was written by Fredoun Sahabujan, and that book was released in 1990. So the movie can be found on YouTube with English subtitles. So I'll be linking it in the description below as well for those who want to watch it. It can be a tough watch. I'm going to be completely honest. It can be a tough watch, so please go in prepared for that. I want to give you a trigger warning for domestic violence, violence against women, pedophilia, and discussion of sexual assault. I'm going to be talking about the movie now, so if you'd like to watch that movie without spoilers, feel free to click away now. With that being said, this movie sort of opens on us meeting this French-Iranian journalist. His car breaks down on his way to try to get to I think some border so that he can fly home essentially to France. His car breaks down, and so he goes to the nearest town to get it fixed. When he gets there, he's able to talk to somebody to get the car fixed, and he's kind of approached by this older woman from the village, and she's like, hey, be wary of these men, they're devils, like, don't talk to them. And like she's trying to get him to talk to her, because she wants to, like, she sees that he has like a tape recorder and hears that he's a journalist, and she wants to tell the story of what happened to her niece. Now a couple old men from the excuse me, a couple of older men from the village kind of comes like, she's crazy, don't talk to her, she doesn't know what she's talking about, because she's like, they're devils, don't trust them. And then when that happens, they try to convince him to come talk to him, and he's like, no, I'm just here to pass time, I just need to do that, I'll go work on some paperwork with some coffee, like, I don't want to do too much of anything. And he goes off to like a cafe to work on some stuff. The older woman finds him, and she puts a note in like some foil and a little bone, and like she throws it at him so that like it kind of convinces him to. The note is a map to her place so they can talk, and so he actually goes. The journalist goes to her place, and they talk, and she's like, "I want to tell you the story of my niece." And she kind of goes in, and so this is kind of where the majority of the movie is we're kind of flashed back into the telling of this story. And so the story follows Zara, I believe her name is, and she and her niece Soraya is married to this man in the village who is actually abusive, but this man actually wants to divorce her to so that he can get with a younger woman, because they are Muslim, I believe, and so because he can't afford to maintain both wives, he is told like he wants to divorce Soraya, but Soraya has to agree to be divorced, like to the divorce, in order for that to kind of happen. And she's not agreeing because she's like, how will I survive without this husband? And so she's like, in order to like for her safety and well-being and the well-being of her daughters, because the husband plans to take their sons with him to the city where he works, she's like, no, I'm not going to divorce you. Like, we still need your income. Like, we still need you here, like your assistance here at least, so that like they can survive in that city. And so what that happens, Zara's kind of like telling her like, hey, maybe you like kind of just talking through it with Soraya about like her plans and what she feels she needs and stuff like that. Then it is found like the husband, he went straight to I believe he's like the village, like almost like the village like clergy. I believe the name was like Mullah or something like that. And so like he's kind of the person they all go to for like religious things. And so he tries to go to convince Soraya to divorce her husband, and she's like, no, I don't want to do that. But then like, even in trying to convince her to do that, he tries to proposition her to that he was like, you can be not necessarily like his bride, but like almost like something similar to that would essentially have her in his debt, and like have her having to use her body for like to get her and her needs met for her and her family, her daughters. And we find out later in the movie that she's kind of just like, she never wants to do that again, because in the past he's sort of had to do something similar, and she's just like, she refuses to be put in a situation similar to that ever again. But yeah, so all that happens. Then we get flashed to a scene where the husband comes home and he's just really upset and he's getting really angry at her. He's actually violent with her, and he's complaining about not making enough money. And we actually like in that scene can kind of see that like her sons have kind of also been indoctrinated into like, so they live in a very patriarchal society in this town. And so in this patriarchal society, of course, it's like men are the top, women are subservient, women are not equal to men in this society. And so like the sons being born men also sort of see themselves as above, even above their mother. And you can see that like the father and the society in general has kind of indoctrinated them to that like sort of thought process. We see like the oldest son kind of rattling on about, well, like not necessarily rattling on, but he's kind of defensive of his father, because Soraya actually, she's like, I'm not having it. Like, she's not backing down. She's like defending herself, defending what's going on, like the situation at hand. She's like, this isn't what's supposed to be happening. Like, I'm not doing that because we need stuff. Like, if you made more money, maybe we have meat for dinner. And yeah, like, then like the son actually like makes a mess, trying to defend the dad, and then like is forced to clean the Soraya is told to clean it up almost immediately, and like she gets up and she actually kind of gets angry and like throws stuff, and like she takes her daughters and leaves to go to Zara's house, or her aunt. And she even notes like her daughters have like, this is the calmest they've ever slept when they're over at the aunt's house. Like they're too usually scared to sleep even at their own home. So all of this is sort of happening. Then there's a death in the village of one of the guys' wife, and Soraya is kind of helping with like making sure all of these women don't come and steal the stuff from the lady's house. Like the body wasn't even cold yet, and they were like in her home. Well, body wasn't even buried yet, and all these women came in her home and was like trying to take her fabric, trying to take her sewing machine, trying to take her jewelry, all kinds of stuff. Soraya was the only one that was just like, hey, don't do that, and was like trying to stop everybody. And so people thought that was nice. And then the guys were outside and they were talking about essentially that like the guy who just lost his wife, it doesn't have anybody to take care of him anymore. And so they're like, oh well, maybe Soraya can help with like feeding, like cleaning his house and feeding his family, because he had a son. And they get Zara to convince her Soraya to do it, and she's like, well, she won't do it without a fee, because it's like, yeah, she was like, why couldn't they ask anybody else, like why her specifically? But it was like, well, maybe with a fee. And so Soraya agrees actually to do it because it's a job now she has her own income coming in, and so she's wanting to save up so that she can afford to exist on her own. And then while this is happening, we see the husband get this idea to kind of like start a plot to essentially accuse his wife of adultery, of sleeping with the man that she's going to be working for. And so he goes to the religious person, and he's like, hey, what do I need to do in order for her to get this? And even the religious person, that person's like she's got a job, like if you can just wait, you can like, she'll divorce you eventually. But he's like, the husband is like, if she's dead, I won't have to pay her, like, because it's kind of like paying her a sum essentially when they divorce. And so all of this is happening. He's essentially like spying on his wife, and trying to find any evidence he can to like get her to be able to accuse her of adultery. It turns out they need at least 2 witnesses. And then like the mayor proceeds over like the stuff, and like, long story short, he claims himself to be a witness, and he also starts gossip in their town about her sleeping around or like doing stuff with Hashim, which I believe is the name of the guy whose wife passed, that should only be done with a husband. And he even actually threatens Hashim to lie and say that Soraya is doing something that she's not supposed to be doing there, so that like she will be accused of adultery, it'll have more weight to it. And so they do that. They go to the mayor, and she gets accused of adultery. They go have a little sort of sermon, not sermon, but like they kind of congregate together and decide, a little court almost, essentially, of just the men, like not even she's involved. And they get her to, like, they tell her, all right, you've been condemned to death essentially. And so she has to prepare for this. She's kind of going through everything. You see there's some really cool moments where like she's with her children. Like she gives her youngest daughter a necklace, she gives her oldest daughter uh, a ring, and then like she's sort of talking to Zara as they prepare her to go be stoned, essentially. They surprisingly, not so surprisingly, I guess, but her sons actually come and see her and are like the youngest one is actually a bit upset and is like, why does this have to happen? And she's just like, she actually says don't watch, but the oldest kind of comes in and like tells the youngest to be a man, tells the youngest like he needs to act like a man. And when Soraya's trying to say goodbye to the oldest, she grabs him to try to like speak to him, and he like yanks himself away and goes and leaves. And then after this scene, we kind of get them walking to the designated site for the stoning, and she is put in there's like a pit, and then they like kind of pretty much like bury her halfway, and essentially they start to stone her. Her father is the one set to be the first people to throw the stones at her, but every stone he throws misses. And then the husband picks up a stone and throws it at her and like hits her square in the head. And then even the sons, they tell the sons to throw stones at their mother, and they pick up stones and they throw them. And then it is after that then the rest of the remaining men in the village, all of the men in the village, all start throwing stones at her, and they start pelting her with rocks, ultimately killing her. And at the end of this, so like after those first couple of stones that the sons threw, they sort of stopped. And then after she has passed, and like her body is sort of laying there, we see the oldest son, who was just sort of like ripping himself away from her. He's crying, and everybody is going to celebrate because some like little circus actually came to town, and they go and they have like a celebration after this happened. And you see the oldest son sort of crying to himself after what he just witnessed and what just happened and what he participated in. And then Zara is also like beside herself, and she's crying and she's super upset because they just killed her niece. And you see they don't even let her bury the body, actually. Like they throw the body by the river, and they don't let her bury the body or give it any type of proper burial. And so like it is only at the like super early the following day that when Zara goes to try to do something for the body, that like she finds the bones of her niece, because like dogs, because they're like in a desert, and so because like dogs kind of picked and ate at her body. And so like yeah, and then we kind of flash forward back into the present where Zara's kind of telling the story to the journalist, and like he lets out a few tears because it is a really, really sad story. And like Zara's like, and this just happened yesterday. Then the guy who was fixing his car, Hashim, comes and is like, hey, your car is ready. He sees that there is a recorder, and then once he leaves, he goes and tells the mayor and the mullah that hey, he was recording the conversation. And they're like, we can't let that journalist leave with that information. What they don't know is that like the actual recording of the conversation, he was not in the tape, was not in the recorder. It was in like Zara actually has the tape. And so they go and they're like, hey, we're actually not going to let you leave. We can't let you leave with your recorder or with your stuff. And so they actually like take his recorder, they take out the tape that's in there that's not the actual tape, and they like rip out all the, you know, the tapey stuff that's in cassettes. And it's just like, all right, you can go now. And like they give him his stuff, he gets in the car and he drives off. And then it's like further down the road, Zara's like, she holds up the cassette and like she runs and she gives it to him, and they're like, oh no, stop her, go. And then they're chasing and trying to get to him. They pull out guns and they're like really trying to get at him. And yeah, ultimately though, like his car actually kind of breaks down a little bit, and he's like, oh no, they trying to, but Zara like sort of protects him and like gives him like a few extra seconds, and within those few seconds he's able to get away and drive off. And that sort of ends that movie. Now, in this description, you might have noticed I didn't mention anyone asking for forgiveness or anyone outright seeking forgiveness. And that was on purpose. I'll be honest and say that I Googled movies about forgiveness and chose two in particular that I had not seen and I thought looked really interesting. And this movie popped up on one of those lists. And so, now sure, this doesn't follow what we might expect, but it is a lot of folks' reality. Forgiveness does not always look one way, and I believe forgiveness and the reality of it has the potential to look several ways given this movie. Now, forgiveness can be simple, or maybe simple isn't the right word, more like straightforward, as it was in Marakkave Ninaikiren, where the incident happens and the person who did wrong, they come forth, they acknowledge the harm that they did, and they ask that person who did the harm, they ask for forgiveness, and then the person on the other end is able to decide whether they will grant forgiveness or not grant forgiveness. But forgiveness can also be complex. Like, what if it's too late for forgiveness? As it was with Soraya's son. What if you might struggle with forgiving yourself, as likely to have happened with Zara, as it was in the movie The Stoning of Soraya M. Forgiveness is not linear. Forgiveness will look different for different people, and sometimes you just won't be forgiven at all. I think it is important that we know that forgiveness is for you and yourself alone. A New York therapist whose work that I follow put it this way: forgiveness is each person's choice. It's not even a required part of healing. Someone could have pushed themselves, worked hard, and transformed themselves into a total different person, and it is still someone else's prerogative to not give them and or to never want to deal with them again. And someone can heal and live a full life without ever forgiving the persons who have harmed them and or harmed others, and that's fine. Not everyone will forgive. So his name is Pierre, the therapist, and I'll be linking his blog in the description below. Definitely check it out. It's a lot of really cool articles on there and a lot of really cool resources, actually. But this very sentiment was most evident in Marakkave Ninaikiren when Sumi was seriously considering moving on with her life without Kanagu. She had prepared herself and sort of like just steeled herself for the reality to what her reality would look like without him. Like, she talks about, like, I actually did get to a place where I was just like, I can parent this child alone, like, without you. And honestly, and that was her prerogative. Like, now, yes, she did ultimately forgive him, but it was on her terms. I don't think the same could be said for our other work of art. So The Stoning of Soraya M. Now, in this movie, while we don't see this per se, we get enough of an idea of our character to know that she would not have forgiven her husband, or ex-husband. It was fairly blatant throughout this movie that his disregard and violence toward her, and she did not like it, and she only put up with it for the sake of her children and because that was what she was supposed to do. If after all that happened and she was somehow be reached out to, and like say she survived this stoning and that like maybe death ultimately didn't occur to her, say she was, all that happened, somehow she survived, somehow time passed and she was reached out to and asked for forgiveness by him, I wholeheartedly believe that she would have declined to forgive him. Quite frankly, I do agree. Like, he was terrible. But of all the harm and the violence that was inflicted upon her, she does not have to forgive him. Like, it's okay to not forgive people. It is possible to still live a healthy life and not forgive people. The only forgiveness that I would say is necessary is self-forgiveness. If Sumi had never forgiven Kanagu, she would have also been well within her right. She was hurt and traumatized, and if she had simply chosen to move on, um, and like forgive herself for what she experienced and keep it pushing, it would have been okay. And I like that's not to say that she felt guilty about the situation, personally, but oftentimes like so when something bad happens to us, so like just as people, um, sometimes we have a tendency to blame ourselves for what happened, and so even when it's not something that we could have personally like controlled or even been like even like sort of like saw the future and been able to like circumnavigate type stuff, um when it's not something that we could have been at fault for, sometimes we still will blame ourselves. And so like the only person Sumi would have needed to forgive was herself in that situation. So like because this could have been possible that maybe Sumi blamed herself for not predicting or not seeing the future and being able to be like, oh, this was going to happen, I should have known, or something like that. But this kind of isn't unlike that of Zara in the stoning of Soraya M. While I'm sure that like Zara sort of understood that she was not at fault and that she did all that she could within her power given the time and place that she lived, but I don't doubt that she still wishes she could have done more. That her wish to have done more is likely what drove her to talking to the journalist when he came to town, actually. Forgiveness, even self-forgiveness can be complicated. I say this as I remember that of Soraya's son, who were encouraged by their father and essentially like pressured by the men of the village because of their expectations to participate in the harm and violence of their mother endured. Like, how do you forgive yourself for participating in the death of your mother? Like, will he understand that he was a child, that he was pressured not only by his father, who he looked up to, and by the town and like everyone around him, and like just this societal pressure, but like also just like pressured by the expectations to meet that male role that was placed on him because he was born a boy. Will any of that even matter? Like, how do you forgive yourself for something like that? Would you be able to forgive yourself for something like that? And so yeah, it's like, will any of that even matter for him? And so yeah, while forgiveness can be complicated, it is still able to follow like the traditional route that one would assume, kind of like in Marakkave Ninaikiren with Sumi and Kanagu, or it can be a bit more complicated, like in the stoning of Soraya M. So maybe even forgiveness too can be an art, an art like everything else. Either way, it's entirely up to you. Last but certainly not least is this week's awe moment. So for this week's awe moment, I'm reading an excerpt I found the excerpt on Twitter, but it is from the book The Strength in Our Scars by Bianca Sparacino, and it reads as follows. You're going to realize it one day that happiness was never about your job or your degree or being in a relationship. Happiness was never about following in the footsteps of all of those who came before you. It was never about being like the others. One day, you're going to see it. The happiness was always about the discovery, the hope, the listening to your heart, and following it wherever it chose to go. Happiness was always about being kinder to yourself. It was always about embracing the person you were becoming. One day, you will understand that happiness was always about learning how to live with yourself. That your happiness was never in the hands of others. It was always about you. It was always about you. And so that I thought was a really beautiful excerpt, just in general, because kind of just like your happiness sort of always being about you, and that like sometimes it does take time to realize that. Granted, I do think happiness can be communal, but I do think you kind of do have to start, or it is easier to start from yourself and go outwards. And that that's going to require being a bit kinder to yourself. And being kinder to yourself sometimes, or at least a lot of the time, actually starts with being able to forgive yourself. So, like, I know we talked about how complicated self-forgiveness can be. But yeah, sometimes we as people, we aren't able to anticipate all the bad that is happening. And sometimes we blame ourselves for that. Or sometimes we make mistakes. And sometimes we hurt people. And while we don't need to be redeemed, necessarily, kind of like how I was discussing in my last episode, I do think it is important that we at least try to forgive ourselves and move forward and try to do better in that regard. But yeah, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.